a land value tax could potentially ameliorate some of those effects there. So yeah, I got really interested in land value tax. I'm super happy to be here and talk about it. I don't know how many minutes you wanted me to talk for, but I could go on and on about the benefits of land value tax, or I could switch more to a Q&A thing. What did you prefer?
Sorry. If you want to give another few minutes,
Yeah.
7 minutes or so of remarks, and then we'll do 10 minutes of Q&A. If that works.
So
Sorry.
I'll just give the economic argument for why land value taxes are great. Unlike other taxes, like an income tax punishes you when you earn income, when you work. A property tax punishes property development. If you build a property, you're going to get taxed at a higher rate. Sales taxes discourage consumption. Capital gains taxes discourage investment, but taxing land doesn't discourage anything. The land is going to be there no matter what, so it doesn't have any distortionary effects on the economy. And moving from, say, a property tax to a land value tax would spur development of housing, because people would no longer be punished for building properties, multifamily units, apartment buildings on a plot of land. They would actually be incentivized to make the highest use of the land, because there's no sense in owning land if you're going to be taxed a high amount on it. You would want to at least do something productive on the land to make up for that tax. So land value taxes are great for economic growth. They're also great for encouraging housing development and making sure that housing development or property development goes in the places where the land is the most valuable, where people want to live, where they want to work. Another great thing about land value tax is that it's equitable. You tax land that is more expensive, and more expensive land tends to be owned by wealthier people. There's also a racial equity aspect to it. There's a lot of research that shows that neighborhoods that are predominantly Black, the land values are lower in those areas, because people are less inclined to live in places where undesirable people live, whether that's based on race or based on income or wherever it may be. It also makes it so a place like wealthy areas, they tend to invest more in amenities like schools. They tend to have, better police departments, better fire departments, all that stuff. And it would mean that in order to have the privilege to live in a place that has high amenities, you are being taxed for that privilege. And places like that have lower income people with less amenities, they're not given a higher tax burden for living in that area. They actually would have a lower tax burden for living in that area. And if the land value tax were pegged to the land value, as we have changes in our environment, the land value tax would adjust for that. So if you're living in a place that has been hurt by climate change, that is flooding or having storms, or is just less desirable to live, then the land value tax would adjust for that. And there's also ways to build a lot of other equity building things into the land value tax, or social promoting things, like if you wanted to give credits for having land that is carbon capturing, you could incorporate that into the land value tax. So it doesn't necessarily have to be based on the market value. It could be based on the value to society, to even promote more things that I'm sure the Sierra Club would want, like more green spaces or more things that are good for society overall that we think we're under investing in. So yeah, that's a broad overview of why I, as an economist, really like land value taxes, and I'd like to see more of them being utilized.
Thanks, Daryl. We're happy to open it up for questions. You could put them in the chat or unmute if you'd like.
Could you talk about the strategy that Detroit is using, and why that was mentioned in the New York Times story this weekend?
Yes. So a place like Detroit has been suffering from economic decay. If you're familiar with the history of Detroit, it used to be this bustling city with all this industry, but then the auto industry went into decline, and the city responded by raising taxes to cover the shortfalls in their taxes. And when you do something like that, you get into a doom loop, where if you raise property taxes, for example, homeowners leave, they go to the suburbs, they go to places where they can dodge those property taxes. If you raise income taxes, then the jobs leave, or if you increase business taxes, then the jobs leave too. And Detroit, in trying to meet its budget needs, has raised taxes in a way that actually encourages less economic development, and it got kind of on this doom loop. But a way to raise tax revenue that actually encourages development and economic prosperity instead of discouraging it is to tax the land. And in a place like Detroit, where there is lots of vacant land being held by speculators, a land value tax would discourage that speculation, which doesn't contribute anything to the economy. Going into Detroit and buying vacant lots and keeping them vacant doesn't help anybody. It actually hurts Detroit because that land isn't being put to productive use. It's not creating jobs. It's not creating housing. If you tax those vacant lots so that they're being taxed just as much as a house, as a lot that has a home on it, that maybe has an apartment building on it, or even a business on it, then you would get fewer vacant lots and more land that's being put to productive use. So switching to, or incrementally switching from property taxes to land value tax should hopefully spur more development in Detroit and get it out of this tax doom loop and on a trajectory where its economy is growing instead of declining. Just to jump on that question, to elaborate on that question, if land value taxes are great, not only for places like Detroit, which have had economic hardship, they can also be great for places that have a lot of economic prosperity. Because again, if you have economic prosperity, there's an opportunity for speculation, and a place that has a growing number of jobs, people might move in and take up lots and hold on to them in hopes that they're going to sell for more in the future. So even a place that is seemingly having a lot of prosperity, they may be underdeveloping their housing because of this kind of speculation, and a land value tax would disincentivize that kind of speculation and promote more use of land that is productive.
Thanks, Daryl. A question came up in the chat about some examples. Maybe you could provide, or Representative Elkins. How does Minnesota's homestead tax and property tax rebate offset the burden of property tax in low-income neighborhoods? Maybe this is more a question for Representative Elkins, but
well, it helps the penalty, but it really doesn't provide the development community with any incentive to develop the land more intensely. So I was going to mention this when we got to my part, but we can get into this now. So we do have cities in Minnesota can't do this now. So we have enabling legislation. The bill is House File 1342, if you wanted to look at it. And one of the big impetuses for us, pressing for this now is that we saw that in the wake of the civil disturbances after George Floyd's murder, you now got all of these newly vacant lands along, devastated corridors like Lake Street or West Broadway or University Avenue in St. Paul. And there was a concern that speculators would swoop in on these, burned out places, and then just sit on them and speculate them and not redevelop them. And so when we were putting this bill together, it would be discretionary for city to adopt it, and they could adopt it in specific zones. But we thought enabling cities like Minneapolis and St. Paul to implement land value tax districts in some of these blighted areas would be a really good way to test out the theory. Turn some of these areas into land value tax districts and see if it in fact does discourage speculation and does encourage the a more quick redevelopment of these areas.
I'll to that a little bit too. I'll make up some math. So say you have a $200,000 property, like a single family home, on a lot, and land is worth $200,000. So the property value and the land value together would be $400,000. I'm just going to use easy math. A 1% property tax on a $400,000 property would then be $4,000. And then let's say you have another house, $200,000, and it's on a plot of land that is only worth, say, $100,000. Then you have a $300,000 property, 1% tax would be $3,000. Those property taxes are very similar, even though the second property is on land that is much less valuable. So moving to a land value tax would make it so that the home that's on the less valuable land would be taxed a lot less. If it's $200,000 versus $100,000, now you're moving to a 2-to-1 difference as opposed to a 4-to-3 difference. Sorry, I'm spreading up a lot of math, but the basic point is that if you're taxing the land as opposed to the property is going to be worth the same no matter what land it's on. But the land is going to be different based on the average income in the area, the school quality, the safety, all these other factors. So if you move to a land value tax, you're naturally going to tax areas that are struggling more less. And the people who live in those places are not going to be paying as much tax, which would be an equitable distribution of taxes, more so than what you would have under a property tax.
Lots of great questions and comments in the chat, but let's move to Tim's had his hand up for a minute. Tim, do you have a question? Then we'll go back to the chat.
Yeah. So first of all, I'm really excited to hear about like some of the stuff with land value tax, and I do think it is a good option for incentivizing some density, which really helps lower prices in general. But one of the main drawbacks I have whenever I hear land value tax is that while I can see, you know, benefiting in a lot of ways, I'm thinking about like how you mentioned like neighborhoods that are predominantly Black have lower land values sometimes. And I'm also thinking about what happens when an investment like the Blue Line extension is open in a neighborhood. And if we're thinking about the value of land and how that like land value tax is supposed to try to get more efficient use out of the land, like what are the ways like that like you're not just displacing people by doing that, like, or for example, like if you have a spot where there's like a duplex there, and you know, if the spot gets upzoned and now, you know, the person who's owning that property is selling it off for an apartment building, and a lot of the other values are going up at the same time, like what are some strategies that you think would be able to mitigate some of that?
Well, in the current regime, whenever an area improves, say it gets increased transit or increased amenities, property values go up. And without a land value tax, what happens is that homeowners get this great bump in their equity, but renters, they pay. Landlords are going to raise their rent to the maximum amount that they're able to charge. And if there are more amenities and more people want to live in the area, the landlord's going to charge more. So right now, gentrification or whatever you want to call it disproportionately hurts renters who tend to be lower income. But moving towards a land value tax, it would even the playing field so that whether you own the land or whether you rent the land, you're equally feeling the increase in values. And at least under a land value tax, instead of all the money going just to the property owner or the landowner, it goes to the government, which could spend that money on like tax rebates, or it could reinvest that money in a way that actually benefits the people who live there. When it comes to displacement, I think that's more of a question for the representative, because there are things you could do to kind of offset that and help and make it easier for people to stay in their homes longer. Like you could have rent relief, or you could have direct payments to citizens. But I think if we're just doing small incremental changes, it probably won't be a huge change. But yeah, I'm open to ideas on that. But I just want to make it clear that at least currently, people are hurt, but it's only renters, and at least under a land value tax, it would be more even between whether you're a homeowner or a renter.
Thank you. I'll take a question from the chat. Is there like a example of like a one-to-one comparison of current state versus desired state with LVT, like for residential, commercial, and public spaces?
Sorry, can you repeat that? Desired what?
Let's see, I'm reading Sylvie, I might be pronouncing name wrong, but in the chat, can you do a one-to-one comparison of current state versus desired state? Maybe that's getting at revenue generated, and I think you maybe already addressed this, that it could be revenue neutral. If the person that posed that question could give us some clarity. We can
Well,
make,
I don't know if this directly answers the question, but the value of land is dependent on the zoning. If you have an abundance of commercial zoning and not enough residential zoning, that residential land is going to be more valuable. So I guess if you impose a land value tax, the zoning would kind of factor into the land value depending on the relative amount of commercial zoning versus industrial zoning versus residential. And you could like modify your zoning to, I guess, change those values if you wanted to. But yeah, I'm not really sure exactly what if that helps with the question or not.
yeah, I just saw a second chat related to that. And basically what does the overall effects of LVT have for the community? And I think we addressed this a little bit, but can we talk more about other intangible benefits of impacts that LVT can have?
I think the biggest benefit is that when you have an LVT tax, for every dollar that you generate, there is no downside to economic growth. So it doesn't, so if you have, say, a really high property tax, you're going to have fewer properties that are being built. So you have a lower tax base. If you raise property taxes to 100%, for example, nobody would want to buy a property because it wouldn't be worth anything. And that goes for income taxes too. If anytime you raise income taxes, it discourages people from working in the city or in the state, because now they're going to move to some other state and work somewhere else where the income taxes are lower. But when you tax land, there is no downside. There is no deadweight loss, which is what economists call it. It doesn't distort the economy in any way. There's no way for anyone to dodge it. So I think the benefit of the community is you pay less and you get more in terms of what that tax dollar could do for your community.
Right.
You're just posing it in an interesting way. So I think if you look at if you read the New York Times article, looked at what Detroit is trying to accomplish, as Daryl was explaining earlier, they're in this doom spiral where they keep having to, increase the property taxes for the people who are actually living there, because the speculators who own the vacant lots aren't paying their fair share. So this would shift the tax burden from people who are actually living in the community and trying to make it a community to the land speculators to make it more expensive to speculate. So more homes get built in those communities and they're repopulated. But in the short term, it would definitely be a big benefit to people who are actually living in homes in those communities, because their property taxes would go down.
And since this is the Sierra Club, I'll bring up also the environmental benefit is that you have housing being developed in the urban core where land values are the highest. It would encourage that instead of having developers go out to the suburbs and the exurbs where land is cheaper and they can build sprawling single family homes. And that means that you have less environmental damage from development. It goes in the areas that are already urban as opposed to going into these more rural areas, and also means you have less traffic, less carbon emissions from people commuting in to the urban area. It's better environmentally for more housing to be built in the urban core where people aren't using their cars as much.
Raise the holding cost of the land, it's more intensely developed, means more housing units on each acre of land, which is good for the environment. You end up supporting transit, you support biking and walking in denser communities because people can walk to their jobs and their stores, and denser communities are just more energy efficient.
Thanks for articulating that. I think that's one of the principal reasons a lot of the co-host organizations are so interested in LVT. I want to voice Representative Cincemura's great question. In my humble opinion, who could possibly be against LVT and why?
I
So I
can,
think, okay, go ahead, you got
why,
it.
Daryl, if you've got I've got an answer too. Why don't you go first?
The person who is the kind of the boogeyman to the land value taxes is I think the older person who bought their home a long time ago when homes were very cheap and couldn't potentially afford an increase in their taxes when land values go up. And I think that that person may be harmed directly by land value tax, or they may benefit indirectly. Because even though they may not be able to afford to pay the land value tax on their single family home on like an acre lot in the middle of the city anymore, there's a potential to there's now an incentive for there to be more housing built that could serve that person better. In many places, the cost of senior living is going up, and part of the reason senior living costs are going up is because it's very expensive to develop new housing for seniors, and it's also expensive to employ people to live and to work in those facilities and care for elderly people. And a lack of housing contributes to rising cost of living, which makes it difficult to employ people. So even though this person who may not be able to hold on to their home, there will be more opportunities for them to have a better life if the land value taxes are used in a way that supports development of more housing that actually better fits their needs. So I think that boogeyman is a little bit like short-sighted. Yes, some people may be incentivized to move, but hopefully they're moving into a better situation, not a worse one.
And to that, I would add that, part of it is just entropy. People aren't familiar with the concept, and they just need to, we need to educate them about the benefits. But the other, I would say for me, the primary pushback comes from our assessors. So under Minnesota law, the assessors are already required to assess the value of land and improvement separately, but they don't actually use those separate values for any purpose. And so they mostly concentrate on getting the overall value right. And they're very concerned that if people start paying attention to their assessed values of the land itself, they're going to have to pay a lot more attention to getting that part of it right. And a lot of them right now just kind of use it as some kind of a fudge factor. So the biggest party we have to win over is the assessors.
Speaking of assessors, Cliff has a question about how we can improve the accuracy of land value assessment, since outside empty lots, most of the observational data for assessments is from the sale of land and improvements. Any thoughts on?
A little bit, and the Met Council staff has done some really good work, showing what factors value of land, and some of the work that Todd Graham and his team have done. They could really do some foundational. They've really done some foundational research that could help support the assessors in this purpose. And when you look at a burned out corridor like portions of Lake Street, there's lots of vacant lots, and they're going to have to assess them anyway. And it's also a very good laboratory for studying the assessment of land values more accurately. There's going to be a lot of vacant lots changing hands.
Thanks, Representative Elkins. Let's go back to Bruce has his hand raised. Bruce, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. I build and renovate infill housing and own properties in South Minneapolis that are rentals, and they're in high density, good traffic corridor type areas. So the tax would go up quite a bit on those because they're in highly desired areas. If you double the tax on these properties, the renters will end up paying more rent because the expenses will go up dramatically. So I'm one, because the whole equation needs to be at least tax revenue neutral, right? So if there's areas that are going down, there's areas that are going up, you know. That's my concern. So I guess you mentioned that there isn't any downside. I see that as a downside. I also see people that have to move, which is gentrification, as a negative. But I just want to turn it back to you, Daryl, so you can touch base on that.
Yeah. So land that is, so let's say you have a plot of land and there's a huge apartment building on it. With a property tax, that building is going to be taxed a lot more than that exact same land with just a single family home, or that exact same land if it was held vacant. So if you're moving from a property tax to a land value tax, the apartment building would actually be taxed less under the land value tax than it would have been under the property tax. So you don't have to worry about the holders of that apartment building being taxed more. They would actually be taxed less. And then to your question of, if we, let's say we increase land value tax without changing anything else, won't that be passed on to renters? I don't think that's true, and a lot of economists would think that that's not true, because landlords, they don't charge generally renters what their costs are. They charge renters what they're willing to pay based on demand. And if they have to now pay a higher tax, they can't pass it on, because if they could have charged more rent, they would have already been charging more rent. And there might be a few cases of really nice landlords who have offered their tenants rent control for many years and have not been making a profit, or as much of a profit as they could have. I don't think that that is the majority of landlords. I think most landlords are in it for the profit, and they try to make as much profit as they can. And if they don't want to pay the tax, they can sell, and then somebody else will buy and pay the tax and charge the market rent as well. It doesn't have any impact on the demand for apartments. It only impacts the holder of the land, and that land will be there no matter what. So even if they feel like the tax isn't worth it, they want to get out, somebody else would come in and then pay that tax. And yeah, as long as demand is neutral, it wouldn't actually change what renters are paying. But I can follow up on that if you'd like. It's a little bit wonky from an economic perspective, but I think the main point is that land is fixed, so it is the landholder that ends up paying the tax, not the renter.
Minneapolis Council Member Payne, you have a question?
Yeah, I was curious around the impacts of, so the land value is going to be highly predicated on what's its permitted uses are, right? So if it's zoned for a 10-story apartment building, that's going to be worth more than zoned for a single family home. And our current regime of establishing property taxes based on the market value, more or less. I'm just curious about, like, if it's zoned for one thing, but it can have a permitted use for a more intensive thing or more productive thing. Like, how do you technically set the value of the land based on the zoning? And then kind of like part B to that question is, we from time to time, well, setting aside that Minneapolis is in the middle of a lot of lawsuit court entanglement with a significant upzoning for single family homes. From time to time, we do have to change zoning. And sometimes that process can get political, and it's not just the technical planning elements behind it. And I would imagine that the moment that a piece of land gets zoned from, and I doubt there's a normal case of it getting zoned from a single family to a 10-story, transit 10, but like those zoning differences are going to have a major impact on the value of that land. So like question A is, how, if you can use up to 10 stories, but you could build down to 5, what's the value? Is it the average of what that expected use would be? And then B is like, what happens when, you infuse politics into this process, and all of a sudden zoning is happening for, like, zoning changes are happening for things other than the kind of technical planning, like substantive reasons. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I'll try. It's a very political question, but I'll try to answer it from like, I'll try to do my best. Well, I think currently zoning is already used for political purposes, and it's already true that if you change the zoning of a plot of land, that would change the value, that would change the property's value, because property taxes already incorporate land value taxes. So all of the issues that you brought up, we already have in some form. Moving from a property tax to a land value tax might amplify those problems a bit, but it would depend on like how abrupt the changes. I think the changes we're talking about are pretty incremental, so I don't think that that would really change a whole lot overnight, just shifting slightly from a property tax to a land value tax. And then another thing you brought up from a practical matter, like what happens when the zoning changes. I think like property taxes, at least in their current form, don't reset like like instantaneously. There's some time that goes on, and then properties sell, and then assessments are done. So if the zoning were to change, I don't think that would mean that value taxes would shoot up instantaneously. There probably need to be some time allotted for like more sales to happen to get that assessment to be accurate before
I'm
the
walking,
assessment
but I'm
changes.
well, supposedly.
Thanks.
Looking for other questions here. Folks are, I love how folks are kind of answering each other's questions a little bit here too. Let's see.
There was a question I saw, Josh, so it's an interesting one. In many cases where this concept has been considered, what's really been proposed is kind of a hybrid, or it's called split roll property taxation, where you assess taxes against both the property and the land, but you assess the value of the land relatively higher, so that the rate on the land value might be twice what it is on the property. And the Minnesota Environmental Quality Board did a report recommending that approach back in 2000, and Mark Haveman from the Minnesota Center on Fiscal Excellence was involved in that study. And I know he's in the audience here today as well. And in that same general period, the Land Stewardship Project did a report called Taxing Our Strengths, which also recommended moving to a split roll taxation. So it's kind of a hybrid of the two, moving in the direction of a land value tax, but kind of a middle ground for those who think that taxing only the property or only the land is a little too extreme.
One of the political challenges that people have brought up could be ameliorated by just moving slowly. That, you know, flipping the switch overnight, going all from property tax to only land value tax, which is slowly taxing land slightly higher than the property, you know, get people used to the idea, hopefully they see the benefits of it, and then continuing along that trajectory, but slowly.
Might also help assuage some of the assessors' worries.
Tim, did you have a question? Tom Diamond? Or is that a thumbs up? Maybe it was a thumbs up. Tim.
Yes.
Go ahead, Tom.
I think there's some misconceptions on some of the assumptions that may not be correct. One of the things talked on the land-based is that land that is less developed is somehow getting a free ride, for example. And that's not true. As a matter of fact, it's quite the opposite. If you have property and limited or no development on it, a building, you do not, you provide for the services where those resources, the property tax goes is provide for schools, provide for roads, provide for other needs in the city. And if you have limited or no people living on that, there's little impact on the roads, there's little impact on the schools, et cetera, because you're not using those services, but you're paying in a sizable chunk to the property tax system to pay for everybody's. So I think that's not quite clearly defined in how this would be impacted. Also, what happens with land-based is the tax now is based on the land and what is on there. And easiest one to show is residential. If you have a nice piece of property with a small, modest a home on it, you're paying a larger percentage, and you, if you have, you would be paying a larger percentage with the land-based tax versus somebody who owns a parcel with a big fancy house, expensive house on it. Where this really comes into, so you would be creating inequities. Also, with the current system, you do pay for a property tax no matter what you have on it. But if you, in part of the effort to protect natural resources in the metropolitan area, and I'll use the river corridor as an example, there's in St. Paul, we have along the river corridor, scientific natural areas, the critical areas established by the state, national park, regional park lands. But part of this area that's determined to be protected is privately owned. Private homeowners are providing the protection of these oak savannas and other lands, particularly along the bluffs. And they don't get paid for that. As a matter of fact, they pay taxes on that, but it provides habitat for wildlife. And this is a major flyway in the nation in North America. So they provide habitat and resting areas, feeding areas for the migration, et cetera. If you change this to a land base, people aren't going to be able to afford to hold on to that property. So that land's going to be lost to development. Those trees are going to be cut down. The wetlands are going to be filled in because of the change, the shift in the balance. Those, for example, in St. Paul, we have areas along the bluffs that have minimum 1/3 acre lots to protect those lands. Those will now become prohibitive, and actually in some legislation would be not allowed. So I think it's simplistic to take a look at some of these things without digging deep into really what the true impacts are throughout it. Thank you for the opportunity.
Daryl,
Thanks,
you want
Tom.
to take that one? Yeah, I'd like to weigh in on that one as well, but go ahead. Why don't you go first and then I'll follow up.
Yeah, so the first half of the question was making the assertion that people who own vacant lands aren't taking from a community, so their taxes should in fact be lower. I don't think that's true. If I live in Wisconsin, say I go and I buy a vacant lot in Minneapolis because I believe that land values are going to go up and I think it's a good investment. I pay no income tax. I pay to the state, I pay no income tax to the city. I'm not buying anything, so I'm not paying any sales tax. I'm not contributing any tax dollars beyond the low taxes that I have for holding a vacant lot because there's no property on it. But I'm also hurting the community because I'm not providing housing. So somebody who wants to live in Minneapolis now has to move somewhere else or live in a farther flung area and commute in and hurt the environment in that way. I'm not putting any office buildings there. I'm not starting a business. I'm not creating any jobs. All I would do is just hold the land vacant and make money while contributing nothing to Minneapolis or Minnesota, except that I would get all the benefits. If Minneapolis improves, if they have more jobs and more people want to move in, I get the benefit of higher land values and an appreciating asset without doing any work, without doing anything, without contributing any other form of taxes. So I think that these vacant lots are a lot more destructive to communities than people realize, because they're displacing people that could be contributing. Yes, you know, children use the schools and you need higher property taxes per child that's using the schools. But the family that's living in a house, they have jobs, they're paying taxes, they're doing a lot for that community. So I believe that having a property being used for housing or for another purpose that's contributing to the economy is better than it being vacant when it comes to benefiting a community. The second point was about, you know, some people are holding land vacant and that's good for the environment. I will concede that, and I think that there are ways around that. If we see that a property is being held vacant and there are a lot of trees and those trees are carbon capturing and that's good for the environment, then we could set up a separate system where you get carbon credits that could potentially offset your land value taxes. So I think that issue can be very easily accounted for to make sure that we still are encouraging things that might not be productive to GDP, but are good for society.
Add to that, you could, if the land is, for example, being held in a conservation easement, you could just simply in Minnesota establish I think we probably already have this, just a lower class rate, taxation rate on land in conservation easements. But to Daryl's point, I'll give you my favorite example in downtown Minneapolis. There was an LLC, investment partnership, bunch of, wealthy doctors, lawyers, and who bought this vacant land right next to Interstate 394 near the Timberwolves arena, and just held it for years. They used it as surface parking. From surface parking, it generated enough revenue to pay the very low property taxes on the property because it wasn't improved, and they held it literally for decades. And then all of a sudden, the Twins decided that, wow, this would be the perfect site for our stadium, and cha-ching. They cash in, get tens of millions of dollars for that property that they just sat on for decades, property for which the streets are already there, the sewers are already there, the freeways were already there, the parking was already there. But that land laid fallow for decades just because it was profitable for this investment group to just wait for some buyer like the Twins to come along. And there's property all like that all over downtown Minneapolis, every place where you see a block of land being used for nothing but on-street parking. That's exactly what's happening. Some investment partnership is sitting on that surface parking lot and generating enough revenue from the surface parking to pay the property taxes, and they'll just wait until some productive investor comes along and wants to develop the property badly enough that they'll pay them a fortune for it. And that's just a huge waste of existing infrastructure.
I want to go to a kind of in the weeds question from Cody. Zoning and lot size interact in a fairly complex stepwise fashion to create developable value. A corridor 640 feet wide lot is not worth exactly 33% less than a 60-foot wide lot because of how setbacks prevent anything of size from being built on a 40-foot wide lot. So Cody's concern is getting some goofy tax impacts on narrow lots with high intensity zoning unless assessors have a deep understanding of what is actually buildable given the lot dimensions. Anyone want to comment on this challenge?
Well, I think
In the weeds.
I have a different bill addressing those kinds of issues, lot sizes and the like. And it's the Twin Cities is way out of the national norms in terms of the amount of land that we require for a home site, especially in suburban cities. And you looked at the way the region had grown, lot sizes were much smaller in the streetcar area because developers wanted to put lots of homes on a street to make sure that there was enough ridership to support the streetcar system. So Thomas Lowry, who built the streetcar system in the Twin Cities, was primarily a real estate developer, and he extended his streetcar system to open up new land for development. And so, the questioner is correct. I mean, all aspects of zoning, including lot size, significantly impact the value of the land. And I would just say that in general, that probably two lots occupying the same amount of land is probably going to be more valuable, actually. And yet cities all over the region are requiring the large lot sizes that are, because they're wasting land, they end up driving up the cost of housing for everyone.
That's a really good segue. I'm going to put one of our partners, organizational partners, on the spot. The Sierra Club, Neighbors for More Neighbors, Sustain St. Paul, Common Ground USA, Minnesota chapter are all kind of working in coalition to complement a lot of the gains that the state legislature made last session. And then coming into 2024 session, we'd like to look at land use tools to complement the gains in transportation and transit funding that we made last year. So, Britt, do you want to touch on that? And Peter Reginius from the Sierra Club chapter can also chime in.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Hi, my name is Britt Unbach. I am a volunteer with Neighbors for More Neighbors, and have been since 2018. I'm one of our policy experts, and the things that we are looking at this year are things like enabling more homes for all Minnesotans with consistent rules so that different cities have to follow the same kinds of rules and they're not passing the buck to each other for who does and doesn't allow housing. Simplifying middle missing housing with point access blocks, which are homes that are extremely common outside of the United States and Canada, but which are illegal to build here due to regulations that we have in place around mostly around making multifamily housing more expensive. We're also talking about parking minimum reform so that we can reduce the amount of parking that we are requiring for enabling more homes to be built. We're talking about creating more housing abundance near transit corridors, which land value tax is a huge benefit for, being able to say that, hey, like, we have this amenity that we are collectively funding. Let's make sure that we have enough homes next to those amenities. And so I really appreciated this conversation with Daryl Fairweather and with Representative Elkins. And thank you, Joshua. Hope that was helpful.
Thanks, Brett. Peter, did you want to comment?
Yeah, just for a moment, if I could. I'm walking home from my daughter's school, and I really appreciate Britt's summary. I just wanted to share an observation about that package of legislation that Britt described, or I should say several topics. It's really interesting that when these issues were considered in Montana, in Wisconsin, in Washington state, it really crossed unusual political boundaries. Or another way to say it is, it didn't fall down along traditional partisan divides. And if you think about it, what we're talking about is legalizing housing, making housing more affordable. And when you consider what's standing in the way of housing and what's standing in the way of housing being more affordable, oftentimes it's government regulation. And that's maybe not the wording that people expect, but think about the fact that the things we're arguing for can be supported from very different political philosophies. For example, a person with a conservative political philosophy could look at what we've been doing to constrain the supply of a legal product, to overuse government power to prevent people from using their private land for public benefit, for private benefit and public benefit, more housing. You can see a person with a conservative background supporting that. You can also see a person from a more progressive background saying, wow, this government authority, overuse of zoning, for example, was used, particularly after the Fair Housing Act was passed, to perpetuate patterns of racial segregation, locking in place patterns that existed back when explicit racial covenants were allowed. And what that means is that because we can make arguments from multiple perspectives in favor of this package of proposals, because it appeals to people across political spectrum, it means that there's more work for us to do building those coalitions. You've probably heard the phrase moving at the speed of trust, and this is an example of that. And I just encourage everyone to be a part of that, be open to untraditional allies in pursuit of these policies, including the land value tax, but also these other proposals.
Zoning reform bills like mine are passing in states like Montana for just those reasons, Peter.
Absolutely. And we need to be comfortable having conversations with folks we're maybe not used to being in alliances with, but it will benefit us all to be open to that.
Senator Rich Draheim, a Republican, is still my Senate author for the bill.
All right. Well, we said we keep it to an hour, and it is an hour on my computer screen. I wanted to thank everyone for joining in. Boy, we could talk about this, and boy, what's going on in the chat is I'm enjoying it too. The back and forth about St. Paul and property tax base. But speaking of both sides of the river. Thank you, Daryl, from the other side of the St. Croix for joining us this evening and all your work on this and other issues. So we really appreciate it, and all the partners and Representative Elkins and elected officials that were able to join and get more informed on this wonky stuff. So. Stay tuned. I did record this, so I'll send out a recording. And a lot of folks asked about that weren't able to join, or if you want to share it. And appreciate you being engaged in this issue. Please check in with any of the organizations if you want to get more engaged locally or in the statewide legislative work. Ramping up in early February of next year. So without further ado, I really appreciate everyone's involvement, and have a great night.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's really learned a lot from this.